and welcome again. Welcome into the television version of Strategies for Living. I'm marriage and family therapist David McMillan. Delighted that you've tuned in, joined with me today here on Strategies. Strategies for Living, well, we're all about helping us live healthier, happier, and more peaceful lives in our bodies, minds, spirits, and relationships here in the 21st century. Now, we do that by engaging in conversations with folks we like to call life strategists each and every time we do Strategies for Living. And Benjamin Riggs, I got to tell you, you are one of my very favorite life strategists, but I'm going to call you the quintessential life strategist for Strategies for Living. You know why that is?
I don't.
Well, a life strategist is someone we define here as someone who will stretch our minds, who will make us think. And folks, I am so proud of this guy. I'm proud to call you my friend, and I'm proud that I know you labored. This has been a labor of love for you. Folks, we're going to talk about it today in some detail. Ben's first book, he's writing another one now. We'll find out about that today too. It's a good one, and it will stretch you. It's called Finding God in the Body, a Spiritual Path for the Modern West. And you're a courageous fella. You open this thing up with, you just bare your soul from the beginning, don't you?
Yeah, well, I wanted to make it not necessarily autobiographical, but I didn't take the traditional, I don't have a classical education.
Right.
And I spent most of my time
You have a street education.
yeah, if we want to call it a street education. I dropped out of college, went and got a job, left from there and went to India.
Right.
And most of my training and study came in the Buddhist tradition. And I feel like everybody comes to spirituality for the same reason, and that's because of suffering, personal suffering. They're looking for transformation. Suffering is what finances that journey.
Right.
And
I like
I'm no
that.
different.
Suffering is what finances that journey.
Yeah, without
I like
suffering,
the way you say that.
Without suffering, there's no reason to step foot on the spiritual path, because it's all about transformation. I'm not going to commit myself to waking up early every day and meditating. I'm not going to commit myself to study. I'm not going to commit myself to self-reflection. Those things aren't fun. They're not entertaining. It's not like being on a roller coaster. So the only reason I would do that would be because I really want things to change, you know. And I'm no different. And so I feel like my credentials are not in initials behind my name, and they're not in a degree. They're in that I was suffering. As a result of my suffering, I sought out transformation and found it. And I wanted to share my own path in the book.
As you know, Ben, and I certainly don't hold myself out as any expert at all. An expert's just a drip under pressure, so I hope I'm not that. But I do, through the radio program especially, have the opportunity to visit with a lot of spiritual writers, authors. And I got to tell you, my friend, this is a rich book. I would put it up against any that I can think of in this moment of spiritual writers today. You really do stretch us. You make us think. Did you find God in your body?
Yes, but not in the way I think most people would. I think a lot of the times in conversations I've had with people about the book title, they assume that what I mean by that is sort of like our body is a temple, take care of the body,
right.
That kind of thing, which isn't really the emphasis.
That's not really what you mean.
No, I do play heavily off of the concept of the body as a temple, but what I mean by that is the temple is, especially, that phrase comes from Paul, and when Paul says that the body is a temple of the Holy Spirit, what he means is God lives in the body.
Right.
The temple is the dwelling place of God, and so that's the sense in which I'm using it. God lives in the body. The spiritual journey is an internal search, and the only way to make tangible an inner journey like that is through practice. practice is the vehicle, it's the mechanism by which we're able to explore that inner space and actually have an immediate a relationship with God that's defined by immediacy and contact, presence, rather than thought and speculation.
What's the difference between, most of us are into, and we're so much into our thoughts and speculation that we are literally lost. And how does that relate to this thing that we call the ego, Ben?
Well, I think essentially what the ego is it's a representation of ourselves. It's a representation of who we are that's constructed by thinking about our own thoughts and putting forward an image that we believe will be profitable in any given situation. So, sitting on this set, having this conversation with you, my mind is looking to generate an image that it can project out into the world that will be profitable or advantageous for me in this situation.
Right. You want to sell books.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, and in addition to that, like this is to not even make it. I don't think that the ego is inherently problematic. For example, if
Well, no, we need it. It's like a vehicle.
yeah.
Yeah.
Well, and it has evolutionary purposes. The whole concept, the institution of the ego, sort of evolved with those things in mind. If I'm on a walking around a plain in Africa, and suddenly a giant cat pokes its head up above the grass, it's helpful for my mind to be able to insert my image into this situation and use
run
that
like heck.
proxy
Yeah.
to figure out that this isn't going to be
This isn't going to end well.
no, this is not going to be a good exchange. Don't go over there and pet the kitty. Run like hell, like you said. And then furthermore, the ego's what enables me to insert myself into a hypothetical situation and determine or calculate and come up with some risk-reward scenario before I
So the ego is not useless, and yet so many of us are so immersed in our egos, we're like fish in water. We don't realize we're in the water until somebody takes us out.
Yeah,
and generally that's through pain and suffering, right?
Yes. So, and it's interesting. The ego is something, it's an image that I construct and project into a situation so I can calculate the risk-reward factor of
Right.
this. It was meant for life and death scenarios, obviously, not to determine whether she'll say yes or no if I ask her out.
But isn't, from the ego point of view, isn't all of that, quote
Life.
unquote, life and death? Wouldn't the ego have us believe that if she doesn't go out with me, I'm going to die, Ben?
Which is a perfect segue into the problem with the ego. The problem with the ego is not it as an institution, is our understanding of it. And so long as I believe I am the ego and I've confused the ego, which is a proxy or a representation of who I am,
Right.
so long as I confuse that with who I actually am, then yes, that's a life or death scenario as to whether she says yes or no when I ask her out. And so insight comes from meditation practice. That's the goal of meditation, is to settle the mind enough to see inwardly and to see the reality of who we are. And when we see that, we
Can't I
realize,
just decide that? I mean, do I have to sit and do I have to do the work? Can't I just decide and say, okay, well, I accept that? Or is that my ego talking?
well, the idea that I can just say, well, the ego isn't who I really am, and I just know that now, and I will move forward with that knowledge isn't grounded in experience. And without it being grounded in experience, it has no meaning or value, and therefore lacks the force needed to be able to actually initiate real change in my life.
Okay.
So there's a pragmatism to this as well.
Okay.
That demands kind of like a radical empiricism where I have to, this transformation has to be rooted in personal experience.
I have to have skin in the game.
And without the skin in the game,
I
there's
have
no
to have
juice.
I have to have the money put up. I got to be ready to put the money up.
Absolutely. Without
in
that
quotations.
change isn't going to last.
Yeah.
It's all based on sort of fantasy.
What's the starting point then? If our viewers are listening to us, and of course we want you to get a copy of Finding God in the Body, because the details are here, but and we'll come back and tell you how to do that. But what's the starting point?
Well, the starting point is suffering. The Buddha starts his teachings with the first noble truth, the truth of suffering.
Yeah.
And the interesting thing about suffering is it's absolutely true. I buy into the idea that I am my ego, and with that comes a certain degree of certainty. And but this is an illusion. And regardless of whether she says no and I thought she would say yes, regardless of whether traffic's just thicker than I thought it should be on the way over here, all that's happening in those moments where our buttons are pushed and anger rises to the surface is there are these little moments where the illusion of control is called into question. And a window opens up and we see through that window into the reality, which is that our mind isn't in control of things. It's generating expectations and holding those expectations over the world.
Our ego sure wants us to believe the mind's in control, though.
Absolutely it does, because that's a very comfortable feeling. Everything feels very predictable. But, a sane person is, by most standards, just someone who generates reasonable expectations that most people will conform to. And we become unreasonable when our expectations place too much strain or burden on other people. But it's in those moments where people refuse to conform to our expectations that there's this window, and we see through that window into the reality, which is that our mind isn't in control. It's generating probabilities is what it's doing.
Right.
We're going through life, and it's probable that I'm not going to bump into much traffic on I-20.
But I'm not controlling a doggone thing.
No, it's probable that there won't be much traffic at 2 o'clock on I-20. But
there could be surprises.
Yes.
Are you seeing, folks, why I'm saying he stretches us, he makes us think? Benjamin Riggs, he's the author of Finding God in the Body, A Spiritual Path for the Modern West. We've got more with Ben Riggs today. He's our life strategist here on Strategies for Living. Stay right where you are, don't go away.
You may be better able to keep your budget out of hot water with these hints on how to save water and money. Outdoors, check for leaks when turning your irrigation system on. Mulch the garden to keep water from evaporating. Water your lawn in the evening or early morning so the sun doesn't evaporate what you've just sprayed on. Sweep your driveway instead of hosing it down. Indoors, get a water-efficient washing machine and dishwasher and run them only when they're full. Get a water-saving shower head and cut your showers down to 4 minutes or less. Put a flow-restricting aerator on your kitchen sink and consider a water-efficient toilet, too. Insulate your water pipes so you get hot water faster and don't have to let it run while it heats up. Take this 2-step leak check. Before you go to bed at night, look at your water meter. If the reading has changed substantially by the morning, you may have a leak. Get it fixed to keep the money you spend on water from flowing away like, well, water. Here are some tips that can help commuters stay safe and on schedule. For starters, if you're driving to work most days, investing in a car with a better safety rating can pay dividends. When you are buying a car, it's wise to check with the Insurance Institute for Highway Safety to see the model's safety rating. In addition, there are newer high-tech features, such as lane departure warnings, blind spot detection, and traction or stability control, designed to make the stop-and-go driving often associated with commuting a safer experience. If you're behind the wheel, resist the temptation to multitask. Eating and drinking while driving can make your car ride less safe. And stay off the phone. According to a study by Carnegie Mellon University, driving while using a cell phone reduces the amount of brain activity associated with driving by nearly 40%. Once you reach your destination, park in a well-lit and busy area. When leaving the car, place everything of value in the trunk and make sure it's locked. Finally, lock your car and take your keys with you when you leave. Social media and mobile technologies are affecting more than how people get in touch with friends these days. They're also changing the way consumers and companies do business. While at one time disgruntled customers would write a letter to the company, today they take to posting their displeasure on social media sites. There are 4 other trends it may pay firms to know. One is information overload. Data is abundant, and companies need to make sense of it all and translate to action. Another is the power of the network. Network technology lets people access information and insights from internal and external sources in real time. Then there are flexible work styles. Companies and employees are adopting more flexible and mobile work styles, making physical workspace less important and collaboration tools more important. Finally, there are distributed teams. That is, people work across organizational and geographical boundaries to get things done. The company that can keep up with these trends may well see a bottom line it can be happy to boast about on social media.
Welcome back. Welcome back into Strategies for Living. Obviously, you are watching Strategies. This is the television version of Strategies for Living, but don't forget, we started this thing on the radio 25 years ago, Ben. Can you believe that?
It's a long time.
Strategies for Living Radio is 25 years old, and we are still News Radio 710 Keel, 101.7 FM, Sunday mornings between 9:05 and 10 is where you can tune in to us, and also at www.strategiesforliving.com, and Thursdays on healthylife.net out of Los Angeles. And today, Benjamin Riggs, the author of Finding God in the Body, and it is a spiritual path for the modern West. Now, best thing to do is jump over to Amazon.com and order a copy. You're going to want to continue the conversation that we're starting today with Ben Riggs. So how do you do that? We'll get Finding God in the Body, and you're working on a new book now as
Yes.
we speak.
Yes, it's entitled The Triumph of Principles.
Oh,
Yeah,
okay.
it's, which is actually a quote from Emerson. And it's interesting, I said earlier I didn't really have a classical education. Well, most of what my education focused on was Eastern spirituality. And so I came at Emerson through the back door. And he was introduced to me as a transcendentalist, which is a word that gets thrown around a great
Right.
deal in
Right.
Eastern, particularly the West's interpretation of Eastern religion. And it was said, he was influenced by Vedanta and all that and Hinduism. And so I just kind of thought, well, he was an early attempt of the West to interpret Eastern philosophy, and I didn't have much interest in him. And as I'm researching this new book, The Triumph of Principles, which is the story, in a sense, it's twofold. It's the story of how the 12 Steps of Alcoholics Anonymous became sort of the quintessential American spirituality and the greatest
Yes.
contribution that America ever made to the world of spirituality. And then on the back end of it, it goes into each of the 12 steps and the picks them apart and looks at the ideas and the philosophy that underlies them, the sources of and inspirations for those steps, as well as the application of them and how it applies to people far outside the scope of at least substance abuse type addiction.
Absolutely.
But I early on make a case in the book that everybody's suffering from addiction.
And we're all addicted to some things.
Yeah.
And generally, for most of us, it is things.
Yes.
We may
It's
not be. We may not be at step one. We may not
Yeah.
be willing to admit that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, and it's as if our life is just sort of plucking along, and then we just hit this, something pushes a button in us, and suddenly there's just this kind of whirlpool or
Yeah.
spiral that drags us down into this abyss. Now, the abyss for each of us might not be as desperate or as unmanageable as you would see with alcoholism or drug addiction.
Right.
There might not be chronic unemployment or life-threatening health problems or broken marriages, but I guarantee you there's a sense of meaninglessness. I guarantee you there's
Still profound pain.
yes.
Can't
And
wait for that.
suffering.
Can't wait for that book. But we're talking about Finding God in the Body today. Now, the problem in doing a program like this is we actually need about a 5-hour program, and even then, I don't think we would do anything more than scratch the surface of this. So, folks, what you've got to do is you've got to go get Finding God in the Body. I want to zero in. There's the chapter titles are compelling to me in and of themselves. Ben, I think you did a very good, thoughtful job picking your titles. The Truth of Suffering, The Examined Life, The Backdrop of Impermanence, The Birth of the False Self, Project Becoming, Refuge. But chapter 7 just jumps out at me from its title as well as its content. The space between fundamentalism and atheism.
Yeah.
At first you would think, well, no, what do you mean? How could those two be related?
Yeah. Well, they share a lot more in common than I think most people want to admit. In fact, you said 5-hour block to go through it all. I do a Finding God in the Body workshop, and maybe it's worth mentioning to the audience that in November I'll actually be doing one in Shreveport at Breathe Yoga. But even then, like those.
And so the folks can go to your website, which is
Go to Breathe Yoga's website, and you can register for the workshop there. It'll be in November, and then that'll be my last workshop in Shreveport for the year.
Okay.
But even in the workshop, we don't get to breach the conversation of fundamentals on atheism much, other than to talk about for religion to be transformative in the way that, or spirituality to be transformative in the way that it's intended to be. Because, and when I say intended to be, it's not, I don't know what the author of a particular religion or spirituality intended when they wrote it.
Right.
Don't care.
Right.
It's what brings me to it,
Right.
which is suffering.
Right.
And if suffering brings me to it, then transformation is my intention. And so there has to be a pragmatism involved. What works has to ultimately be the driving force.
Right.
And that's really as much as we address fundamentalism and atheism in the context of the workshop is our belief systems, our ideas. It doesn't matter if we're talking about a secular philosophy or we're Pentecostals. In either case, the question comes down to, is this working?
Yeah.
And with fundamentalism and atheism, I think what we find is that on the one hand, we have a group of people who are certain about ideas that pertain to religion in the positive, the
Right.
affirmative.
Right.
And then on the other hand, we have a group of people who are certain about ideas as they relate to religion in the negative.
Certainty is the common denominator.
Certainty is the common denominator, and the inability to differentiate what they think from reality. So for the religious person, and this is a point that's made in the book I'm working on right now over and over and over again, which is, if suffering brings me here, and then the proposition is, for a spiritual solution, the proposition is that coming to believe, and whatever that means, this spiritual solution can remedy my suffering. Well, then it doesn't make any sense for me to say the spirituality or the beliefs that you had before you got here are sufficient to solve the problem, because they're clearly not. They
Right.
coexisted with the problem.
Right. They did not clearly solve your
And-
problem.
Yeah, and so the ability of the fundamentalist to be able to see their religious ideas or beliefs as insufficient is really, often it's inoculated by the religiosity. But on the other hand, the same thing applies to atheism.
Mm-hmm.
Your ability to reason or solve a problem solely with the intellect alone has not worked, as evidenced by the fact that suffering has brought you to this question.
Right.
You know, and so when we look at suffering and atheism, I think what we find is there's a middle ground, and that middle ground is more or less, that middle path is more or less paved by pragmatism, what works. And so if you find that a particular religious belief works for you, then you should pursue it.
By all means.
And if you find that one does not, you should drop it. But there has to be a willingness to experiment.
Right. At the very least, open your mind to questions.
And that's another thing that they both have in common. The certainty that both of them have in relationship to ideas.
Blocks the ability to ask questions.
Yes, neither one of them are willing, the fundamentalist is unwilling to experiment with religious ideas and practices outside the scope of what would define orthodoxy for them. And the atheist is unwilling to experiment with anything that in any shape, way, form, or fashion could undermine that sort of secular ideology.
How long did it take you to write the book?
I started writing the book, I think in total it was near 4 years. However, that includes an awful lot of editing and writing a manuscript and then going, I don't like this.
And
then
baby
kinda
dictator
starting-
in between.
Yeah, and then having a child and
Getting doing little things like getting married and
Yeah.
having a kid,
Yeah.
which you and your wife call baby dictator. That
Yeah.
should tell us something right there.
Yeah, yeah. And so having a 2.5-year-old boy right now certainly slows the process, because I've got about 4 o'clock rolls around and writing ends, and it's time to be Spider-Man.
Time to be.
I've got to put my Spider-Man
Got to
costume
put the
on.
Spider-Man suit on, and
Yeah.
Mom's going to come home and put her Wonder Woman suit
Yeah.
on, and do whatever
And
baby
then we gotta eat
dictator.
dinner.
Yeah. The pots and pans of life.
Yeah.
What do you want people who, what lets you know? What really lets you know, hey, I've done good with this book? When people read it, what do they say to you that lets you know?
The two things that have been, so one of them's flattery.
Yeah.
I've had several people compare it to Thomas Merton, and that's hard because
That's good stuff.
I'm pretty much in love with Thomas Merton's writings. And the second thing would be, and this is probably the more meaningful. The first is just pure flattery. It would be.
By the way, stay away from hair dryers.
The second one would be spirituality without practice is just wishful thinking. Like it's just a mass hallucination.
Okay.
It doesn't
So
matter if
it's-
we're talking about Buddhism, Christianity.
Put the rubber to the road.
Yeah,
Put
if-
the rubber to the road.
If your ideas aren't being matched with action, you're just daydreaming.
Folks, you got to get this book. I think we've given you some sense, some idea of why. This is rich. Finding God in the Body, A Spiritual Path for the Modern West. Benjamin Riggs, a local boy done good. Get it at Amazon.com, wherever you buy books, and look for Ben November at Breathe Yoga.
Yep.
Look for him. You can go to breatheyoga.com, Google it, and jump in and find God in the body. Ben, thank you for being, as always, a wonderful life strategist.
Thank you for having me. Enjoyed it.
Folks, thank you for being a wonderful audience today. Come back and join us. Don't forget, News Radio 710 Keel, 101.7 FM, Sunday mornings, 9:05 to 10, and www.strategiesforliving.com. For Ben Riggs, I'm marriage and family therapist David McMillan. See you next time here on Strategies for Living.